The slap echoed across the marble floor of the Grand Lagos banquet hall. 200 guests watched in silence as the billionaire's mother struck her pregnant daughter-in-law across the face. But instead of tears, the pregnant woman smiled. She pulled out a phone that cost more than most cars and pressed a single contact, Dad's office. Within seconds, the mother's face drained of all color as she recognized the voice on the other end. Black vehicles were already pulling up outside. Someone extremely powerful was coming, and the billionaire suddenly realized his wife had been hiding cards he never knew existed. How had they missed the signs? What had his wife been planning for 3 years? And why did those security guards suddenly look terrified? 3 years earlier, Daniel Matthews had met Grace at a small restaurant in Victoria Island, Lagos. She was a waitress, serving tables with a quiet grace that caught his attention. He was a billionaire, heir to the Matthews empire. She was beautiful, kind, and seemed genuinely unimpressed by his wealth. That made her different from every other woman he'd met. They married within 6 months. His mother, Margaret Matthews, hated Grace from the beginning. The girl came from nowhere, had no family anyone knew about, and wore simple clothes from discount stores. Margaret made sure Grace knew her place. She criticized everything, Grace's cooking, her clothes, her hair, the way she spoke. Grace never fought back. She simply smiled and apologized quietly. Daniel's friends thought he'd married beneath him. But Grace was kind, patient, and never complained about the insults. She seemed grateful just to be part of his world. Then Daniel met Victoria at a business conference in Abuja. Victoria was everything Grace wasn't: bold, expensive, confident. She came from the Richardson family, wealthy hedge fund managers everyone knew. The affair started within weeks. Daniel told himself he deserved someone from his own class. Someone who understood his world. Someone who wasn't just a poor waitress who'd gotten lucky. His mother approved of Victoria immediately. Margaret started inviting Victoria to family dinners, making sure Grace saw them laughing together. Making sure Grace understood she could be replaced. Grace was 3 months pregnant when she found out about the affair. Daniel expected tears, screaming, maybe a divorce demand. Instead, Grace simply nodded and said nothing. That should have been his first warning. For the next months, Grace became quieter. She spent more time alone, typing on her phone, making calls she ended quickly when Daniel entered rooms. He assumed she was calling her non-existent family, crying to friends who didn't exist. He never asked who she was really talking to. Never wondered why she seemed so calm despite everything. Never noticed that her cheap maternity dresses couldn't hide the expensive watch she sometimes forgot to take off. Margaret suggested the banquet hall humiliation. She needs to understand her place once and for all, she told Daniel. In front of everyone who matters. Daniel agreed. Victoria thought it would be entertaining. They planned it for weeks, the perfect public humiliation that would break Grace completely. The night of the banquet, Victoria deliberately spilled champagne on the marble floor. Then she handed Grace a cleaning rag and bucket. "Clean it up," she said loudly. "It's probably the only job you're actually qualified for." Grace took the rag without arguing. She knelt down, her pregnant belly making the position painful, and started scrubbing. The guests whispered and filmed. Some looked uncomfortable, but nobody intervened. This was entertainment, watching the poor girl learn her lesson. Daniel watched his pregnant wife scrub floors and felt nothing except mild irritation. He'd become so used to his mother's cruelty, so comfortable with Victoria's mockery, that he couldn't see what he'd become. But 3 security guards at the entrance saw something different. They watched Grace with professional intensity, their hands moving to their earpieces. Something about her posture told them this wasn't what it appeared to be. Grace was calculating something behind those downcast eyes. Running numbers. Making plans. Waiting for the perfect moment. That moment came when Margaret raised her hand to deliver the slap she'd given dozens of times before. The slap that kept Grace in her place. But this time, when Margaret's hand connected with Grace's cheek, everything changed. Grace stood up slowly and smiled. Then she pulled out that expensive phone and pressed one button. What happened next would destroy everything Daniel thought he knew about his wife, his family, and his entire life. The phone rang only once before a man's voice filled the speaker. "Hello, sweetheart," the voice said loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. Daniel's blood ran cold. He recognized that voice. He'd heard it only twice in 8 years, during company-wide conference calls at Wellington Global Industries. It was Thomas Wellington, his boss, the trillionaire owner of the company where Daniel worked as senior vice president. "I'm walking into the building right now," Thomas continued calmly. "Your mother and I got your message about the situation. Are you safe?" Grace touched her reddened cheek, still smiling that cold smile. "I'm safe, Papa. But I need you to meet my husband and his family. I think it's time they learned exactly who they've been treating like garbage for 3 years." Margaret stumbled backward, her hand gripping the champagne fountain for support. Her face had gone completely white. Victoria's phone slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Her mouth opened and closed without sound. Daniel felt his legs go weak. Wellington Global Industries. Thomas Wellington. The most private billionaire in Nigeria, whose daughter's identity was one of the best-kept secrets in the country. The daughter he'd been told was protected by security protocols that would make government agencies jealous. The daughter whose face had never appeared in any newspaper or magazine. The daughter he'd married 3 years ago without knowing who she really was. "You're lying," Margaret whispered, though her voice shook. "You're just some waitress. You never mentioned your family. You never—" "I never mentioned them because I was conducting an experiment," Grace interrupted quietly. "I wanted to see what kind of man Daniel really was when he thought I had no power. No resources. No family to protect me." She looked at Daniel with eyes full of profound sadness. "I wanted to see if your love was real or conditional. If your mother's cruelty would be stopped by your integrity, or enabled by your cowardice." Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. His mind was racing through 3 years of memories, seeing everything differently now. The simple wedding dress that cost less than the flowers, Grace could have bought the entire venue. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed without reading, because her own assets were protected elsewhere. The discount store maternity clothes, while she wore underwear that probably cost hundreds of thousands of naira. "You failed every single test," Grace continued, her voice steady despite the tears now sliding down her cheeks. "You chose your mother's approval over your wife's dignity. You chose your mistress over your child's mother. You chose cruelty over character at every single decision point." The banquet hall doors burst open with a sound like thunder. Thomas Wellington entered, surrounded by a security team that moved like they'd protected presidents. He was tall, imposing, wearing a suit that probably cost more than the entire banquet hall. But his eyes were focused only on his daughter's swollen cheek. Behind him walked a woman Daniel recognized from a single photograph, Catherine Wellington, Grace's mother. A former federal prosecutor whose reputation for destroying opponents in court still terrified young lawyers. Thomas crossed the floor quickly and gently touched Grace's face where Margaret's handprint was still visible. "Did anyone else touch you?" he asked softly. "Did anyone put their hands on you in any way?" Grace shook her head, but her eyes moved toward Victoria. The woman who'd forced her onto her knees 30 minutes earlier. Who'd gripped her shoulders to position her for better camera angles. Who'd stepped on her fingers twice while she scrubbed. Thomas followed his daughter's gaze with laser focus. His attention landed on Victoria, who stumbled backward into a serving table. Champagne glasses toppled and shattered. "You must be Victoria Richardson," Catherine said, pulling a tablet from her handbag. Her prosecutor voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Daughter of Martin Richardson, the hedge fund manager." Victoria's face went pale. "I don't know what." "Your father is currently being investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission for fraud," Catherine continued calmly. "An investigation that my husband's legal team initiated 6 weeks ago. How interesting that his daughter has been sleeping with one of our senior vice presidents while filming his wife in compromising positions." She paused, letting that sink in. "One might almost think there was corporate espionage involved, which carries federal penalties of up to 15 years in prison." Daniel turned to stare at Victoria. His mind was finally making connections he'd been too arrogant to see. All those questions she'd asked about his work. All those casual inquiries about upcoming business deals. All those times she'd photographed documents on his home desk while claiming she was taking selfies. "My daughter signed a prenuptial agreement written by your lawyers," Thomas said, turning to Margaret. His voice was still quiet but now carried an edge that made everyone in the room step back. That agreement specifically stated she was not required to disclose her family assets or background. Margaret's diamonds suddenly looked very heavy around her neck, pulling her down toward the floor her daughter-in-law had been forced to scrub. "The prenup also contains a clause about emotional abuse and infidelity," Catherine added, consulting her tablet. "That clause triggers additional compensation. My lawyers calculated it yesterday at approximately 47 million naira." Daniel felt the room spin. 47 million naira. More than his entire net worth. More than he could pay even if he sold everything he owned. What else had been hidden in that prenuptial agreement he'd barely glanced at? What other traps had Grace, no, had the Wellington family, set for him 3 years ago. Catherine's fingers moved across her tablet screen with practiced efficiency. The prenuptial agreement contains another interesting clause, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd won every case that mattered. If Daniel's family members engage in physical assault against Grace, the agreement becomes void. She looked directly at Margaret, whose face had turned gray. Your slap, Mrs. Matthews, just eliminated every legal protection your son had. It also activated a domestic violence complaint that the district attorney's office is very interested in prosecuting. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. The same hand that had struck Grace moments ago. The hand that had delivered dozens of slaps over 3 years, thinking there would never be consequences. We have video evidence, Thomas said calmly. He gestured toward the large screen on the banquet hall wall. From 6 different angles. The screen suddenly switched from the Matthews family slideshow to security footage. Crystal clear footage showing every moment of the evening. Every word Victoria had spoken. Every slap Margaret had delivered. Every moment Daniel had stood watching without intervening. The 200 guests stared at the screen in horror. They'd all filmed portions of the evening on their personal phones, thinking it was just entertainment. Now they realized they were witnesses to what would become the most expensive assault case in Lagos history. Anyone who filmed tonight's events should preserve that footage, Thomas continued, addressing the entire room. You'll be receiving legal requests within 72 hours to provide it as evidence. Cooperation will be noted favorably. Obstruction will be prosecuted. Daniel watched his entire social circle transform from entertained spectators into potential witnesses against him. He watched them delete social media posts in real time, panic spreading across their faces. His career was finished. His partnership at Wellington Global, gone. His reputation in Lagos business circles, destroyed. Everything he'd built over 8 years collapsed in minutes. Victoria had disappeared into the crowd, probably trying to find an exit. Her father's hedge fund was collapsing. Her own involvement in possible corporate espionage would be investigated. Her life as she knew it was over. But Daniel could only stare at Grace. His wife. The woman he'd forced to scrub floors while carrying his child. I loved you, Grace said quietly, looking at him with those devastating eyes. That's the worst part. I actually loved you when we met. I thought maybe you were different from other wealthy men. Maybe you'd love me for who I was, not what I had. Her hand moved to her pregnant belly. I was wrong. You loved the idea of a powerless woman you could control. Someone who made you feel superior. Someone your mother could torment for entertainment. Daniel wanted to speak, to apologize, to somehow undo 3 years of cruelty. But words felt useless against the magnitude of what he'd done. Thomas placed a protective arm around his daughter. Grace will be moving back to our family estate tonight. All her belongings will be collected under court supervision. You won't contact her unless her lawyers approve it. And the baby? Daniel's voice came out as a whisper. When the baby is born. Your parental rights will be determined by a family court judge, Catherine interrupted sharply. A judge who will review the same evidence being used in your mother's criminal trial. Evidence showing you stood by while your pregnant wife was physically and emotionally abused. She closed her tablet with a decisive click. Evidence showing you prioritized your mistress over your child's well-being. Supervised visitation would be generous, Mr. Matthews. Unsupervised custody would be judicial malpractice. Margaret made a choking sound. The reality was finally sinking in. She wouldn't just lose her social standing. She was facing criminal charges. Assault against a pregnant woman, captured on video, witnessed by 200 people. The charges would be elevated to felonies because of the pregnancy and clear premeditation. I'll testify, Daniel heard himself say. Everyone turned to look at him. At my mother's trial. I'll testify truthfully about everything that happened. Margaret's face crumpled. Daniel, you can't. I can and I will, Daniel said, his voice stronger now. It was the first decent thing he'd done in 3 years, and it felt both liberating and devastating. Grace studied him for a long moment. Testifying truthfully is the minimum requirement for being a decent human being, she said softly. It doesn't erase 3 years of cruelty. It doesn't undo the nights I cried myself to sleep while you were with Victoria. It doesn't heal the damage you've done. She turned toward the exit, her parents flanking her protectively. The security team moved into formation around them. But it might be a start, Grace added, pausing at the doorway. If you want any chance of knowing your daughter, yes, it's a girl, you'll need to prove over years, not weeks, that you've become someone different. She placed her hand on her belly. Someone who would have protected her mother when it mattered. Not someone who discovered integrity only after losing everything. The Wellington family left, their security convoy disappearing into the Lagos night. The banquet hall stood in shocked silence. Daniel looked at his mother, who was crying silently. At the empty space where Victoria had stood. At the 200 guests who would never invite him to another social event. He'd gambled everything on the assumption that his wife was powerless. He'd lost to someone who'd had everything all along but had loved him enough to pretend otherwise. The question now was whether he could become the man his daughter deserved. Or whether he'd remain the coward who'd watched his pregnant wife scrub floors for entertainment. 6 weeks later, Daniel stood in the lobby of what used to be his downtown Lagos penthouse building. Moving crews carried out furniture that belonged to Grace under court order. The doorman wouldn't make eye contact anymore. None of the building staff would. Everyone had seen the news coverage. Everyone had watched the viral videos. Everyone knew he was the billionaire who'd humiliated his trillionaire wife and lost absolutely everything as a consequence. His phone buzzed with another notification from his lawyer. Margaret's criminal trial was proceeding faster than expected. The district attorney had prioritized the case after public pressure from domestic violence advocacy groups. They'd adopted Grace's story as proof that abuse happened at every economic level. That wealth didn't protect women from cruelty. That accountability mattered regardless of social status. Victoria had disappeared entirely. Her father's hedge fund had collapsed under the investigation. Rumors suggested she'd moved to London to escape the social destruction that came from being labeled a corporate spy. Daniel's partnership at Wellington Global had been terminated within 18 hours of the banquet hall incident. His stock options had been revoked. A clause he'd never read carefully now prevented him from working in acquisitions for any competing firm for 5 years. His professional network had evaporated like morning fog. Nobody wanted association with the man who'd abused Thomas Wellington's daughter. Nobody wanted the career contamination that came from defending someone who'd forced his pregnant wife to scrub floors. The penthouse elevator opened and Grace emerged. Her pregnancy was in its final weeks now, her belly enormous. But her posture was somehow straighter than it had been during their entire marriage. She was flanked by 2 security guards and her mother, Catherine, who carried legal documents in her designer handbag like a gunslinger keeping weapons close. Grace wore maternity clothes that probably cost more than Daniel's car. His former car. That had been repossessed last week when he'd missed the payment for the first time in 8 years. But her face showed no triumph. No satisfaction. Just weariness that suggested winning didn't feel the way people expected when victory required destroying someone you'd once loved. The furniture should be loaded within the hour, Catherine said, checking her tablet with military efficiency. The art collection has been transferred to storage. The financial settlement will be finalized once the criminal trial concludes. Daniel wanted to say something. Wanted to apologize or explain or somehow communicate the magnitude of his regret. But words felt inadequate for the chasm he'd created. Grace glanced at him briefly. Her eyes passed over his face like he was furniture being inventoried rather than the father of her unborn child. That casual dismissal hurt worse than anger would have. Worse than hatred. It meant he'd become irrelevant to her in a way that couldn't be reversed through apologies or changed behavior. I need to ask about custody, Daniel said, his voice smaller than he intended. After the baby is born. I want to be involved. I want to be a father, even if I failed completely at being a husband. Catherine's laugh was sharp and professional, containing no humor but significant legal expertise. Your parental rights will be determined by a family court judge who will review the same evidence being used in your mother's criminal trial. She looked at him coldly. Evidence showing you stood by while your pregnant wife was physically and emotionally abused. Evidence showing you prioritized your mistress over your child's well-being. Supervised visitation would be generous. Grace touched her mother's arm gently, asking for silence. Then she looked directly at Daniel for the first time with something approaching warmth. I'm not going to keep your child from you completely, Daniel, she said quietly. But you're going to have to prove over years, not weeks, that you've become someone different than the man who watched me scrub floors while pregnant. She paused, her hand moving to her belly where their daughter was kicking. Our daughter deserves better than a father who chooses cruelty when it's convenient and regret when it's too late. The moving crew emerged carrying the dining table where Daniel and Grace had eaten exactly 4 meals together during their 3-year marriage. He'd always been too busy with work or Victoria or his mother's dinner parties. He watched them load it carefully onto the truck, each movement documented because everything in Grace's life was documented now. Protection against future attacks from people who'd underestimated her once. Margaret's trial was scheduled for next month. The prosecutor was seeking maximum sentencing. Daniel's testimony was expected to determine whether his mother spent 2 years or 10 years in prison. His choice was devastating. Protect his mother and lose any chance of relationship with his daughter. Or testify truthfully and send the woman who'd raised him to prison for actions he'd enabled through his silence. Grace walked toward the exit, her security detail moving with practiced coordination. But she stopped at the doorway and turned back one final time. "I've set up a trust fund for our daughter that she'll access when she turns 25, she said. "Enough money that she'll never need anything from you financially. Never have to depend on a man the way I pretended to depend on you." Her eyes held his. "But I can't give her a good father through a legal document or bank transfer. That's something only you can become, if you're capable of the transformation required." She left without waiting for his response. The elevator doors closed on her face. Daniel stood alone in the lobby of a building he could no longer afford, wearing a suit he'd bought when he still had a career, holding a phone that contained nothing but messages from lawyers and bill collectors. His phone buzzed one final time. A message from his lawyer containing a single sentence. "Your mother refused the plea bargain. Trial proceeds next month. Your testimony will determine the outcome." Daniel stared at the message, understanding that his next decision would define whether he remained the man who'd forced his pregnant wife to clean floors, or became someone capable of protecting his daughter. The choice should have been simple. But 38 years of conditioning made it feel impossible. And that hesitation told him everything he needed to know about whether Grace had been right to destroy him. 3 years had passed since that terrible night at the banquet hall. Daniel sat in a small cafe in Lekki, waiting for his supervised visitation appointment with his daughter. The cafe was nothing like the expensive restaurants he used to frequent. It was modest, clean, with simple furniture and reasonable prices. The kind of place the old Daniel would never have noticed. He'd testified truthfully at his mother's trial. Watched Margaret be sentenced to 18 months in prison. Watched her social standing crumble beyond repair. She'd written him one letter from prison. Not an apology, but bitter words about betrayal and ungrateful sons. He hadn't replied. Daniel had completed the therapy program Catherine's lawyers had mandated. Severed all contact with Victoria, who'd resurfaced in London married to someone with an old family name but little money. He'd moved into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Ikeja. Taken a mid-level position at a small consulting firm that had no connection to Wellington Global or the acquisitions world where he'd once thrived. His salary was a fraction of what he used to earn. His apartment was smaller than his old penthouse bathroom. But he'd learned that humility sometimes came through loss, and character was built in the ruins of destroyed pride. The cafe door opened and Grace entered with their daughter, Sarah. The little girl was 3 years old now, with Daniel's eyes but Grace's bone structure. A court-appointed specialist named Mrs. Adeyemi followed them, carrying a tablet to document every interaction. She'd been monitoring Daniel's visits for 36 months, writing reports that determined whether he could see his daughter. "Hello, Sarah," Daniel said softly, kneeling to her level. His heart ached every time he saw her, this beautiful child who barely knew him. Sarah looked at her mother for permission before approaching. That caution, that need for approval before trusting him, was Daniel's doing. A consequence of choices he'd made before she was born. "Papa brought you something," Daniel said, pulling out a small wrapped package. Inside was a children's book about a father learning to be brave. He'd read dozens of parenting books over 3 years. Attended every therapy session. Completed every anger management course. Done everything the court required and more. But he knew that checking boxes wasn't the same as earning trust. That real change was measured in years, not certificates. Sarah opened the package carefully, her small fingers working at the wrapping paper. When she saw the book, her face lit up with genuine joy. "Can you read it to me?" she asked, her voice small and sweet. Daniel's throat tightened with emotion. "Of course, sweetheart. That's exactly what I was hoping." They sat together at a small table while Daniel read. Mrs. Adeyemi watched from a respectful distance, making notes on her tablet. Grace sat nearby, her expression unreadable. She'd rebuilt her life at the Wellington family estate. Started a foundation called the Dignity Initiative that provided legal resources and financial support for abuse victims regardless of economic class. Daniel had donated to the foundation anonymously. Not much, his salary didn't allow for large gestures. But he sent what he could each month, hoping that somehow his money might help undo a fraction of the harm he'd caused. When the story ended, Sarah looked up at him with those serious eyes. "The papa in the story was scared," she said. "But he became brave. Are you brave now?" The question hit Daniel like a physical blow. How did you explain to a 3-year-old that her father had been a coward? That he'd failed her mother in every way that mattered? I'm learning to be brave, Daniel said honestly. I made big mistakes before you were born. I hurt your mama. I didn't protect her when I should have. He glanced at Grace, whose eyes were glistening with unshed tears. But I'm trying every day to become the papa you deserve. Someone who's actually brave, not just pretending. Sarah considered this seriously. Then she reached out and patted his hand with her small palm. Mama says trying is important, she said. She says people can get better if they really try. Daniel looked at Grace, stunned. After everything he'd done, she was teaching their daughter that people could change. That redemption was possible. Grace met his eyes and nodded slightly. Not forgiveness, that might never come. But acknowledgement that his efforts hadn't gone unnoticed. Mrs. Adeyemi approached after an hour, signaling that the visit was ending. Daniel had learned not to protest, not to ask for more time. Following the rules was part of proving he'd changed. Sarah, say goodbye to your papa, Grace said gently. Sarah hugged him, her small arms wrapping around his neck. Daniel closed his eyes, memorizing the feeling, knowing it would sustain him through another 2 weeks until the next visit. I love you, sweetheart, he whispered. Love you too, Papa, Sarah said, then skipped back to her mother's side. As they prepared to leave, Grace paused. She has a preschool graduation next month, she said quietly. You can attend if you want. You'll sit separately from our family. If you cause any problems, you'll be removed. Daniel's heart leaped. Thank you, he managed. I promise I'll. Don't promise, Grace interrupted gently. Just show up and behave appropriately. Let your actions speak. She left with Sarah and Mrs. Adeyemi, the security detail that still followed her everywhere, moving into formation. Daniel sat alone in the cafe for a long time afterward, staring at the children's book Sarah had left behind accidentally. On the inside cover she'd scribbled in crayon, My Papa. 2 words that meant everything. 2 words he'd almost lost the right to claim. He picked up the book carefully as if it were made of glass and held it against his chest. 3 years ago he'd had wealth, status, and power. He'd lost all of it through his own cruelty and cowardice. But sitting in that modest cafe, holding a crayon-marked book, Daniel realized he was richer now than he'd ever been. He had a chance. A small, fragile chance to become the father his daughter deserved. And this time he wouldn't waste it. The Wellington Estate Gardens stretched across 40 acres of perfectly maintained landscape. 3-year-old Sarah ran through the grass, chasing butterflies while her grandfather Thomas pretended to be too slow to catch her. Grace watched from the veranda, her second cup of tea growing cold in her hands. Her body was finally relaxed in ways it hadn't been during her entire first marriage. But peace came with complicated edges. Healing from betrayal didn't follow straight lines or convenient timelines. Daniel's supervised visitation happened every other Sunday now. The court specialist, Mrs. Adeyemi, had submitted positive reports for 36 months straight. She'd recommended expanding his visitation rights, possibly allowing unsupervised time within the next year. Grace's feelings about Daniel's rehabilitation remained complicated. Part of her wanted Sarah to have a father who showed up and kept promises. But another part, the part that sometimes still woke from dreams where she was scrubbing floors while people laughed, would never fully trust him. Margaret had been released from prison after serving 18 months. Her social standing was destroyed beyond repair. Her friends from the country club treated her like she carried a contagious disease. She'd written one letter to Grace. Not an apology, but bitter words about betrayal and deception. Grace had filed it with her lawyers without responding. Some people never developed the capacity for self-reflection that healing required. Margaret had requested visitation rights with Sarah twice. Both requests had been denied by judges who'd reviewed the security footage showing a grandmother slapping her pregnant daughter-in-law in front of 200 witnesses. Victoria had stayed in London, her Instagram now filled with photos that looked expensive but felt desperate. She'd sent a message 6 months ago requesting to clear the air. Grace had blocked the number without reading past the first sentence. Forgiveness didn't require granting access to people who'd treated your suffering as entertainment. Mama, Grandpa says I can plant my own roses. Sarah called out, her voice carrying across the garden. He says I have to choose colors that mean something. What's your favorite color? Green, Grace answered automatically. The word carried weight she hadn't intended. Green was growth and renewal. The color of things that survived winters to bloom again in spring. The color of things that kept growing even after they'd been damaged. Thomas looked up from where he was kneeling in the garden, his expensive suit covered in dirt. His expression suggested he understood the deeper meaning of Grace's answer. He'd retired from Wellington Global last year, transferring control to a management team he'd spent decades preparing. Now he spent his time with his granddaughter, making up for the years Grace had hidden her identity. Catherine emerged from the house carrying legal documents. Even in retirement, her reading glasses perched on her nose in ways that made her look simultaneously grandmotherly and intimidating. The final settlement just cleared, Catherine announced. Daniel's last payment completed the 47 million naira. The trust fund for Sarah is now fully funded and legally protected from any future claims. Grace nodded, but the relief felt muted. Money couldn't repair what had been broken. Couldn't restore the 3 years she'd spent pretending to be powerless while documenting abuse. Couldn't give Sarah the intact family that children deserved. The Dignity Initiative had helped 3,000 abuse victims over the past 3 years. Provided legal resources and financial support regardless of economic class. Proved that suffering wasn't limited to people without resources. Grace had learned that resources made escape and accountability more achievable. But abuse damaged everyone it touched, regardless of bank accounts or social status. "Is Papa coming today?" Sarah asked, climbing onto Grace's lap. Her dress left grass stains on Grace's white pants, but Grace didn't care. "Papa's visits are Sundays, sweetheart," Grace explained gently. "Today is Saturday. But he's working very hard to be the father you deserve." Sarah seemed satisfied with this answer. Her attention shifted to a bird landing on the garden fountain. Grace's phone buzzed with a message from Mrs. Adeyemi. A photo of Daniel at a bicycle shop, carefully selecting a pink bike with training wheels and a helmet covered in butterflies. The specialist's note was brief: "He's making genuine progress. Recommend continuing current schedule with review in 6 months for possible expansion." Grace saved the photo without responding. Her feelings remained too complicated for simple reactions. She wanted Sarah to have a father who showed up and chose correctly. But part of her would always remember the man who'd watched her suffer and chosen his mother's approval over his wife's humanity. "You don't have to forgive him," Catherine said quietly, settling into the chair beside Grace. "Letting him see Sarah isn't the same as forgiving what he did. You can be a good mother while still being a woman who was hurt badly." "I know," Grace said, meaning it. Sarah would eventually ask questions about why her parents weren't together. Why Papa lived in a small apartment while Mama lived in an estate. Why there were news articles and videos showing things that happened before Sarah was born. Grace would answer those questions honestly when the time came. Would teach her daughter that love shouldn't come with conditions attached like legal documents. That character mattered more than wealth. That choosing correctly when it was difficult to find who people really were. Thomas approached with Sarah in his arms, dirt transferred from granddaughter to grandfather in ways that would horrify his dry cleaner. "She'll have better than what you had," Thomas said, his voice carrying the wisdom that came from building empires and recognizing what actually mattered. "She has you. Someone who knows the difference between power and cruelty. Between silence and weakness." He paused, watching Sarah wiggle down and run back to chase more butterflies. "You didn't just survive what happened. You transformed it into protection for thousands of people through your foundation. That's not revenge. That's redemption." Grace watched her daughter's joy, her laughter carrying across gardens designed for beauty but now serving a better purpose. Providing space for a child to play without fear. Without witnessing cruelty. Without learning that love came with painful conditions. Her phone buzzed again. Daniel requesting permission to attend Sarah's preschool graduation next month. His message was careful and respectful, asking rather than demanding. Grace stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the response options. Catherine's hand covered hers gently. Not directing but supporting whatever decision Grace made. "Whatever you decide, we support you. You've earned the right to protect yourself and Sarah however feels necessary." Grace typed slowly, each word weighted with significance. "You can attend the graduation. You'll sit separately from our family. If you make Sarah uncomfortable or create any drama, you'll be removed. This is about her, not you." She hit send before she could reconsider. Then Grace set the phone down and walked to the garden where Sarah was building something in the dirt that kept collapsing. She knelt beside her daughter, ruining her pants completely, and helped rebuild with stronger foundations. "Mama, you're getting all dirty," Sarah said with delighted surprise. "Sometimes getting messy is how we learn what's really important," Grace said, meaning it more than Sarah would understand for years. Sarah nodded like this made perfect sense, then returned to her building with complete focus. Grace watched her daughter work, covered in dirt herself now, and realized that healing didn't mean forgetting what happened. It meant building something new that acknowledged the damage while refusing to let it define everything going forward. 3 years ago, she'd been on her knees scrubbing marble while people laughed. Today she was on her knees building castles with her daughter in gardens where cruelty couldn't reach. Sarah's dirt castle collapsed again, but instead of crying, Sarah laughed with genuine delight. Because failure in safe places taught resilience rather than fear. Again, Mama, Sarah said with absolute confidence. We'll make it stronger. Grace smiled, covered in dirt and memories and complicated peace. Again, she agreed, her hands in the soil and her heart lighter than it had been in years. We'll always build it stronger. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the garden as grandmother, mother and daughter worked together. Building, collapsing, rebuilding. Each attempt stronger than the last. And in that simple act of creation, Grace found what she'd been searching for since that terrible night at the banquet hall. Not revenge or vindication but something better. The knowledge that she'd survived cruelty without becoming cruel. That she'd had power while choosing protection over destruction. That broken things could be rebuilt with better foundations and stronger materials and love that didn't come with painful conditions attached. Sarah's laughter echoed across the Wellington estate, a sound of pure joy that promised better tomorrows. And Grace finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the worst was truly behind them. We've come to the end of today's story. I hope it touched your heart. Thanks for watching and staying with us till the end. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe for more inspiring stories. See you in the next one. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from?